Welcome. The word eugenics is not common today, but between the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries, it was a topic of international interest. Drawing on a range of evolutionary theories, many believed that society as a whole could be improved through two means: selective reproduction among those considered most fit, while also, at the same time, preventing reproduction among those considered by society as undesirable. The horrors of eugenics are generally tied to the Nazis, especially the Holocaust. But, in fact, eugenics was practiced in any and every country where science was valued, and eugenicists could be found among every racial and ethnic group. Today, we'll look at what is now considered pseudoscience, but which was, at the time, considered central to human progress. In 1883, Francis Galton, perhaps better known as the first cousin of Charles Darwin, coined the term eugenics. It comes from two Greek words, eu, which means happy or good, and genos, which means race or people. So, you could translate eugenos as the good or happy race. At the time, it was often translated as well-born. But of course, you may have never heard the term eugenics. If so, that's okay, because you have probably heard of the synonymous term, social Darwinism. It too dates from the late 19th century, although it did not catch on until the early 20th century. Social Darwinism is often defined with the phrase, survival of the fittest. However, this idea was not developed by Charles Darwin, but by Herbert Spencer. But, regardless of what you call it, beginning in the late 19th century, eugenics became a widespread form of scientific investigation, complete with government and university backing. Behind eugenics was a range of scientific ideas, namely the evolutionary theories of Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monnet, the noble of Lamarck, France. Consequently, he is often known in English simply as Lamarck. He is probably best known today for holding the view, now discredited, that traits acquired by an individual of a species would pass on to that individual's offspring. But his view of evolution was also more philosophical. He held that evolution was a progressive ascent, the progressive ascent of what he called transmutation. This is very different than Darwin's view, which came later. At a wider cultural level, the Lamarckian view really gripped the imagination. Here, evolutionary theory reflected a wider set of cultural assumptions about progress. These assumptions parallel what is often called historicism. That is, the idea that history doesn't simply happen, but that it moves in a particular direction. That is, it progresses and things get better. This idea became extremely popular in the wake of the French Revolution, which happened when Lamarck was in his mid-40s. Historicism, or a progressive view of history, is opposite the view that, over time, things get worse, also known as a declension narrative. A declensionist view of history was generally held in antiquity among the Greeks, Romans, and Christians. But, after the French Revolution, historicism became central to multiple political movements. Marxism, for example, is historicist because it holds that the communist state, where all are equal, is historically inevitable. And, quite obviously, historicism remains a popular belief still today. A view of evolution very different from that of Lamarck came from Charles Darwin. His theory depended on natural selection, which held that, over time, species evolve because some inherited traits facilitate survival while others don't. Those that survive are more likely to reproduce, and thus adaptive traits are passed on. Importantly, for Darwin, this happens randomly, not as part of some grand philosophy of historical or biological progress. But Darwin's ideas did not corner the scientific market. In fact, they were sometimes conflated with those of Lamarck. And here is a good example of the progressive interpretation of evolution. It's the frontispiece of T.H. Huxley's book, Evidence as to Man's Place in Nature. The historian Janet Brown describes this picture as inspired visual propaganda. From a strict Darwinian view, what this image misses is the randomness or contingency that Darwin took as central to evolution. Huxley's illustration is Lamarckian. Therefore, it's wholly un-Darwinian. And this is curious. Huxley and Darwin were friends, and Huxley came to be known as Darwin's bulldog, due to his penchant for picking intellectual fights about evolution that he hoped would sever the relationship between scientific research and the dominant religious traditions and values of his day. Eugenics reflects the conflation of Lamarckian and Darwinian theories. On the one hand, it is similar to Darwin's idea of natural selection, but instead of natural selection, eugenicists advance the idea of artificial selection. You could describe artificial selection as a form of applied evolution. Selective reproduction was key. After all, reproduction passes on traits. If we are selective in our reproduction, can we breed out certain undesirable traits? Theoretically, the answer was yes. And here we see something similar to Lamarck's ideas. Selective breeding would, in theory, facilitate biological progress. In time, people distinguished between positive eugenics and negative eugenics. Positive eugenics can be described as more children from the fit. Negative eugenics, on the other hand, can be described as less from the unfit. In theory, at least, positive eugenics and negative eugenics would work together for the improvement of the human race. At this point, it's very easy to immediately think about Nazi Germany, but this would be a mistake. Eugenics was not restricted to Nazis or other extremist groups. You might say that although Nazis were pro-eugenics, most people who were pro-eugenics were not Nazis. In fact, eugenics organizations were founded throughout Europe and the United States. And eugenics wasn't seen as reactionary or as a product of bigotry. Rather, people thought that it would really lead to the creation of a better society and thus a better world. And yet, it is really hard to ignore the fact that eugenics fed right into a range of often brutal stereotypes. Consider this illustration by the prolific German scientific illustrator Ernst Haeckel. It shows a hierarchy of human races. At the top was something like what you might see in a Greek statue. The Greeks were long romanticized in European societies as a point of distant historical origin, but they were especially romanticized at this time in German society. As you move down Haeckel's hierarchy, you eventually come to the Africans, who were portrayed as being just above simians. And this perspective wasn't unique to German eugenicists. It might sound strange to modern-day Westerners, especially in the United States, but most European peoples believed that their own European group was superior to not just non-Europeans, but to all other Europeans as well. They didn't advocate broad European superiority or broad white superiority. They advocated their own national superiority. Consider Charles Darwin. In his work on the descent of man, he explicitly named the English as the greatest Europeans, writing of the remarkable success of the English as colonists over other European nations. He explained, "Obscure as is the problem of the advance of civilization, we can at least see that a nation which produced during a lengthened period the greatest number of highly intellectual, energetic, brave, patriotic, and benevolent men would generally prevail over less favored nations." Here, too, we see evolutionary ideas combined with broader cultural beliefs. In this case, Darwin lived and wrote during the golden era of the British Empire. So what? So what do you do with this kind of science? For many, the answer was obvious. You needed to apply it to society as a whole. One way of doing so was through phrenology, a now discredited idea which held that the size of your head correlated with the size of your brain, and thus with the extent of your intelligence. Criminology textbooks even claimed that criminals were more likely to have heads of a certain shape, such as being shorter or broader. This, too, was often connected to the racist practices and beliefs in a given society. Some embraced positive eugenics as a kind of ethical creed. In Germany, Ernst Haeckel created the Society for Race Hygiene in 1905. Its members agreed that before they had children, they would undergo fitness tests. These tests were supposed to ensure that their children would have desirable rather than undesirable traits. So others turned to negative eugenics. For example, in the United States, the early 20th century saw 32 states enact sterilization laws. So others pushed for the legalization of birth control and abortion. Consider Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. In her book, The Pivot of Civilization, she writes, "Eugenics is chiefly valuable in its negative aspects." She then goes on to say, "On its negative side, it shows us that we are paying for and even submitting to the dictates of an ever-increasing, unceasingly spawning class of human beings who never should have been born at all. That the wealth of individuals and of states is being diverted from the development and the progress of human expression and civilization." Sanger published The Pivot of Civilization in 1922. It was no chronological leap, then, to the rise of Nazism in Germany that same decade. Nazism depended in part upon widespread assumptions, vindicated by the science of the day, that racial hierarchy was simply true. Positive and negative eugenics were equally parts of Nazi culture. They remained part of American culture too, albeit in less murderous ways. Consider this sterilization pamphlet from the state of North Carolina in the mid-1940s. It reads, "North Carolina is a leader among the progressive states which have provided the legal framework for such desirable social action." North Carolina ended this program only in 1973. By then, the horrors of the Holocaust, the Nazis' systematic murder of millions, had become well known. Today, eugenics is thus discredited on moral grounds. If you're interested in learning more, these books are worth consulting. First is Eugenics, a very short introduction by Philip Levin, a helpful, broad overview that covers the whole sweep of eugenicist theory. Next is Edward Larson's Evolution, the remarkable history of a scientific theory. Larson is best known for his Pulitzer Prize-winning study of the Scopes trial. His book is a broad history of evolutionary theory, including, but not limited to, figures such as Lamarck and Darwin. And finally, to learn more about the German side of this story, read Richard Weichert's From Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics and Racism in Germany. You've probably heard the phrase, "Don't judge a book by its cover." And here I'll say, "Don't judge a book by its title." From Darwin to Hitler may sound sensationalist, but this is a measured study covering the intersection of biological speculation, ethics, and politics. That's all for now. Thanks so much for watching. Please hit the subscribe button, feel free to leave a comment, and I'll see you next time.